Let's bring you this story now. ISIS leader Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi was killed during a U.S. Special Forces raid in Syria. Now, he detonated a bomb killing himself. He detonated a bomb killing himself and his family as troops stormed the building. U.S. President Joe Biden says a dangerous terror threat has now been removed, but experts warn that the organization will soon regroup. Let's discuss the significance of the death of this leader now with Zeenat Adam from the Afro-Middle East Centre. Thank you very much for your time, Zeenat. And that's probably the big question on everyone's mind as we watch these developments unfold. That what does this mean for the IS or the ISIS organization losing a leader and perhaps having a little bit of the agenda disturbed?
Thank you very much for having me on air. I think that what we need to do is to look at the origins of ISIS and recognize that the American invasion of Iraq was very much a means to galvanize that militancy. This was so for al-Qurayshi as well as for his predecessor al-Baghdadi, who were both captured by the Americans after the American invasion in 2003 and were held in Camp Bucca, very similar to Abu Ghraib. They were subjected to the kind of enhanced interrogation techniques that the Americans employed in Abu Ghraib, which included torture, which included electrocution, which included sexual torture as well. Whilst being in Camp Bucca, these people were able to basically have an academy, and out of that grew ISIS. 10 years later, we saw ISIS sweeping across the desert in their Land Rovers and taking over large swathes of territory shortly after the Syrian revolution, and this meant that they spread across vast areas of the desert of Iraq and Syria. By 2019, they were whittled down to 2% of that territory. So in terms of their leadership, in terms of them having that kind of reign over this territory, it has certainly whittled down in the last few years. This began with the Russian aerial bombardments. It also began with the Kurdish and American enforcements in the east of Syria.
You mentioned that it's whittled down over the years, this reign that we've just been talking about. But one would say that it's still quite significant, and the war against these terrorist groups is not over. What would you say around engagement between various global stakeholders in finally or completing dealing with this particular issue?
Well, I think that it is in understanding that ISIS is not doesn't have a central command structure any longer. They have certainly had that breakdown over the last few years. But what we are seeing are different fragmentations, different affiliations that have been brought up in other parts of the world and have expressed their allegiance to ISIS. This would include those in certain African areas, considering themselves provinces of the Islamic State. So we look at areas in Nigeria, we look at Central Africa, we look at Mozambique, but essentially these groupings have expressed that kind of affiliation to ISIS, but their ground infrastructure is very different, their responses to what is going on in Africa is very different, and their roots are very different. If we look at Mozambique, for instance, the root causes of these groupings and the militancy was in response to the marginalization that the local people were feeling as a result of the building of mines and the oil conglomerates that have come into the space without compensation to the local people. And they've only recently pledged that allegiance to ISIS, almost as if to say, well, you know, if you're not going to listen to our demands, we are going to become much more militant and a larger threat to you.
Let's talk about the resourcing of ISIS and affiliated organizations. I mean, you did also raise an important point about these groupings on the African continent, on various parts of the African continent, and we'll get to that because I just want to unpack that a little bit further with you. But resourcing ISIS and affiliated organizations, how exactly does that work?
Well, the initial resourcing began in Iraq, where ISIS had taken over a number of American arms and tankers that had been left behind. They have since also received resourcing from individuals and organizations within the groupings, but this has certainly been curbed as a result of international campaigns to be able to control the kind of funding that would get to these to an organization like ISIS. It is dubious in terms of how that is getting to the affiliates in Africa. And if we look at the modus operandi, some of them in Nigeria, for instance, you'll find the ransoming for cash, you'll find illicit trade that is happening, and this is how some of the funding is coming through. But it's become far more difficult in the last few years.
No, absolutely. And just to zone in now then on the issue on the African continent, we have seen some radical action taken by those who've pledged allegiance to ISIS over the last few years in Nigeria. You've mentioned some other countries on the African continent. It's a tough task for African governments to deal with this. And just based on your analysis on events that have taken place over the last few years on the continent, are our governments sufficiently dealing with what could turn into a major crisis if not dealt with properly?
Well, I think that some of the counterterrorism responses are very much based on the American genre and the American identity of what that should be. And we haven't really developed an African response to these threats, and understanding how these threats have emanated on the African continent. So it's important for us to understand that, and it's important for us to have a more holistic approach instead of the kind of approach that the Americans have had, which has been extrajudicial killings, which has been combative. But really, if we look at it, our continent is becoming a playground for many of the outside players. If we look at the number of military bases that are being established on our continent by forces outside, the Americans, the Chinese, the Emiratis, Turks, you name it. And so our continent, we need to be aware and careful, and we need to understand that this needs to have an African response instead of having a fear factor when it comes to those groups that seem to pledge allegiance to ISIS.
No, absolutely. Zeenat Adam, thank you very much for your time this morning.